For more than 17 years, the Madeleine McCann case has been treated as an isolated tragedy. But the truth is that it may be linked to something much bigger, a dark global network operating in the shadows that needs to be unraveled now. What we are about to reveal could change everything you think you know about this mystery. Madeleine McCann's disappearance was seen as a solitary mystery, a tragedy confined to that night in 2007 at Praia da Luz. But what if this story wasn't as isolated as we believe? There are clues, ignored for years, pointing to something much larger. Dark connections that go beyond Portugal, revealing a global pattern of carefully planned crimes. Madeleine was not the only child to disappear under mysterious circumstances in Europe at that time. Between 2005 and 2008, Interpol records show a significant increase in child abductions in tourist areas, often associated with exploitation and human trafficking networks. Witnesses describe similar situations: children disappearing without a trace, unknown cars prowling quiet neighborhoods, and suspicious figures that no one could identify. In Madeleine's case, the location of the resort is a crucial point. Praia da Luz, although seemingly peaceful, was connected to routes frequently used by criminal networks operating between Portugal, Spain, and other European countries. This area was not just a tourist destination, but also a strategic location for illegal operations. When we analyze the patterns of such crimes, a disturbing picture begins to form. Madeleine's disappearance may be linked to a larger network, a network that crosses borders and uses the anonymity of tourist areas to capture its victims. This is not just a case of a missing girl, but possibly the tip of an iceberg revealing something much more sinister. And this leads us to the most troubling question. If there is a global connection, what does that mean for Madeleine McCann's fate? When I began to look more closely at Madeleine McCann's case, something hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just about a missing girl. It was about patterns, connections that no one seemed to see but were there, like loose pieces of a puzzle. This stayed with me for days, like an uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. It's hard not to imagine what the family went through, but what makes it even more disturbing is thinking, what if it wasn't an isolated case? What if Madeleine's disappearance is linked to something bigger, something that crosses borders? This not only transforms the mystery, but also makes us question how much we understand about the world around us. Cases like this remind me that even in places that seem safe, the unknown can be closer than we imagine. And it is exactly this that leads me to the next part of this story: connections that no one saw, but that could change everything we believe we know. If we look closely at Madeleine McCann's case, some contradictions begin to emerge, and these are what make the mystery even more uncomfortable. From the start, the idea that Madeleine was kidnapped by an intruder was always treated as the most probable explanation. But there are details in this theory that, instead of bringing clarity, only raise more questions. One specific point is the window of the apartment where Madeleine disappeared. The initial narrative suggested that it was used by the kidnapper to enter and exit. However, police analysis revealed that there were no signs of forced entry or any indication that the window had been used in this way. Moreover, it was small and opened directly to the street, a location where any movement would draw attention. So if the window wasn't the point of entry or exit, how did this person manage to act without being seen? Another detail that complicates the story further is the account of Jane Tanner, a friend of the McCanns who was at dinner that night. She claimed to have seen a man carrying a child wrapped in a blanket around 9:30 p.m., walking towards the beach. This witness was essential in reinforcing the idea of a kidnapper. But here's the contradiction. Later, another family in the same area said that the man described by Jane was, in fact, a father carrying his own child to bed. This means that the main clue of the initial investigation may have been a mistake. But if this is true, then what really happened that night? And most importantly, why wasn't this information clarified at the right time? What makes everything even more intriguing is that this type of confusion wasn't unique. During the first weeks of the investigation, reports emerged of people seeing suspicious vehicles near the resort in the days leading up to the disappearance. One was a car parked for hours with a man who seemed to be watching the apartments. At the time these reports were recorded, but nothing conclusive were associated with human trafficking gangs operating in tourist regions. Another point that raises suspicions lies in the reports of unknown foreigners circulating the resort, photographing children, including Madeleine, in the pool area. These individuals disappeared shortly after the case gained notoriety, but there was no coordinated effort to identify who they were. Whether these actions were coincidences or part of something bigger, no one knows to this day. These patterns, contradictory witnesses, clues set aside, and people acting suspiciously are not unique to Madeleine's case. They appear in other disappearances in Europe, occurring in tourist areas and under similar circumstances. What begins to emerge is a disturbing possibility. Madeleine's disappearance may have been part of a larger scheme, a pattern that connects international human trafficking networks to areas where children are vulnerable. But there is something else that is troubling: the lack of effective coordination between authorities. In Madeleine's case, tensions between the Portuguese police and British forces created an environment of mutual distrust, which hindered the investigation from the start. Reports were ignored, crucial evidence went unanalyzed, and leads that could have led to answers quickly went cold. If these failures had not occurred, would we have an answer today about what happened that night? Or do the contradictions, both in the accounts and in the actions of the authorities, point to something even deeper, a truth that someone preferred not to reveal? And this is where the tension increases. Because as we look more closely at the global connections, we realize that Madeleine McCann's case is not as isolated as it seems. And this raises a question that could change everything. How many of these clues were not just neglected, but possibly deliberately covered up? Madeleine McCann's disappearance brings to light disturbing patterns, and when we look at other cases around the world, the connections begin to appear. This reminds me of the case of Eaton Patz, a 6-year-old boy who disappeared in New York in 1979. Like Madeleine's case, Eaton disappeared in broad daylight, leaving no visible traces. The investigation went on for decades without answers, until a forgotten detail, a confession from someone who had been ignored, changed the course of the story. But there is something even more disturbing. Between 2005 and 2007, several children disappeared in Europe under similar conditions. Tourist places, little surveillance, and events that seemed isolated but, together, suggest a pattern. Praia da Luz, where Madeleine vanished, was strategically located on a route that human trafficking gangs used to move between countries. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Are we dealing with truly disconnected crimes, or with a global network operating in the shadows, moving victims and erasing traces? The answer may lie in stories we already know, but perhaps never connected to this case. When we look more closely at the theories surrounding Madeleine McCann's disappearance, two main lines of thought emerge. Both are frightening, but each carries its own contradictions and partial truths, leaving more questions than answers. The first theory is that Madeleine was kidnapped by an opportunistic intruder. This idea is supported by witness reports of seeing unknown people in the area in the days leading up to the disappearance. A man was seen taking pictures of children in the resort's pool, while another was caught prowling the apartments at unusual hours. These behaviors, combined with Jane Tanner's account of the man carrying a child on the night Madeleine disappeared, form the foundation of this hypothesis. However, there is a central problem. If it was truly an opportunistic act, how did someone manage to break into the apartment without leaving traces, carry a sleeping child, and leave unnoticed? The Portuguese police, during the early stages of the investigation, stated that there were no signs of forced entry on the apartment's door or window. This raises a disturbing possibility. The kidnapper knew the children were alone and possibly had prior knowledge of the location. The second theory delves even deeper, connecting Madeleine's case to human trafficking networks. Interpol reports show that tourist areas, like Praia da Luz, are often targets of international gangs looking to move children quickly out of the country. In Madeleine's case, her appearance, blonde, light eyes with features considered valuable by these networks, is often cited as a potential reason for her being targeted. This theory is supported by reports of suspicious vehicles observed in the area before and after the disappearance. One described as a white van was seen parked near the resort. A man with a history of sexual crimes and involvement in human trafficking, Christian Bruckner. Bruckner is one of the most controversial names in the case. He was in the area at the time of the disappearance and had a background linking him to similar criminal activities. What makes everything even more complex is that the police found evidence that Bruckner was communicating with other individuals involved in trafficking schemes, but there was never direct proof linking him to Madeleine's kidnapping. These two theories not only divide public opinion, but also highlight conflicts within the investigations themselves. While some authorities insist it was an isolated act, others believe Madeleine was a victim of something much larger. At the heart of this dilemma is the overwhelming pressure from the media, which turned the case into a global spectacle. Sensationalist headlines created narratives that diverted attention from crucial evidence, fueling extreme theories and undermining the focus on investigations. This division also affected the collaboration between the Portuguese and British police. From the beginning, tensions between the teams hindered the exchange of information, delaying actions that could have been decisive. While the Portuguese authorities maintained their initial theory of an isolated act, the British teams expanded the investigation to include suspicions of human trafficking. This lack of alignment created an investigation full of holes, where possible answers were lost lost amid disputes and bureaucracies. And here lies the biggest dilemma. If Madeleine was indeed taken by a global network, how did this organization manage to act so precisely and invisibly? And if, on the other hand, it was an opportunistic act, why do so many pieces of evidence seem to point to something much more calculated? These theories are like two pieces of a puzzle that never seem to fit together completely. Each carries disturbing details that make the mystery even harder to solve. But as we continue to connect the dots, a third possibility emerges. A possibility that could unite these disconnected elements and reveal something no one expected. When we connect the details that have surfaced in Madeleine McCann's case, it's impossible to ignore a lingering question. Something very important may have been left aside, hidden in the shadows. During the initial investigations, a report mentioned the presence of a vehicle seen hastily leaving the area around 10 p.m., exactly when Kate McCann discovered the disappearance. At first, this was treated as a secondary detail, but years later, the same vehicle was linked to a suspect with connections to international human trafficking networks. The car's description matches other similar cases in Europe, creating a frightening bridge between seemingly disconnected disappearances. And what bothers me most is how this crucial detail was buried for so long. Was the silence around this clue mere negligence? Or was there something or someone interested in ensuring that this lead was never pursued? What is clear is that there are more questions than answers. But the truth seems to be approaching, and it is exactly what we will analyze in the next point. Something was left behind that night, and it could be the key that connects all the pieces of this enigma. When we talk about Madeleine McCann's disappearance, there is a detail that almost got lost in time, but could completely change the course of this story. During the first days after the disappearance, residents of Praia da Luz reported seeing a white van prowling the area. To many, this seemed just another vehicle in a village full of tourists, but something was left out of this account: the behavior of those in the vehicle. Witnesses described a male figure attentively watching the apartments, especially the block where the McCanns were staying. He seemed nervous, constantly looking around. This detail was noted in the early police records, but was never thoroughly investigated. What makes this so disturbing is that years later, when the case was reopened by British authorities, the same van was identified as belonging to Christian Bruckner, a man with a history that eerily aligns with the pattern of crimes associated with international human trafficking networks. But here is where everything gets even stranger. During searches of Bruckner's property, the police found a series of objects that raised suspicions, including photos of children that could not be identified. Among the items were records indicating that he had knowledge of the routes used by gangs to move victims quickly between Portugal, Spain, and other European countries. This connection, however, raises more questions than answers. If Bruckner was involved in something so large, why did the authorities take so long to connect him to Madeleine's case? Was it negligence, or was something? In 2007, a group of private investigators hired by the McCann family found a similar pattern in other child disappearances in Europe. In at least 3 cases involving children between 3 and 5 years old, the circumstances were almost identical: a tourist location, witnesses reporting suspicious vehicles, and children disappearing without leaving traces. But these cases never received the same media or authoritative attention, leaving them buried in reports that few people read. These clues show that Madeleine's disappearance may be just one piece of a larger puzzle, a well-organized network operating methodically, moving between countries and erasing traces with frightening precision. But there is something even more unsettling. During a review of old documents, a detail emerged that many considered insignificant at the time: a map found in a suspect's apartment in Germany containing a marking in southern Portugal, exactly where Madeleine disappeared. The question remains: was this map a coincidence or part of a more elaborate plan? Does this suggest that her disappearance was not something impulsive but carefully planned? When we put all these pieces together, the emerging truth is grim. What seemed to be an isolated case begins to connect with a global pattern, where Madeleine McCann may have been just one of many victims. And while this new information complicates the mystery even further, it also leads us to a crucial point. If there is a pattern, there is something that has not yet been revealed, something that may be hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. And it is exactly this that we will analyze in the next segment. Studies show that more than 8 million children disappear every year worldwide, and only 14% of these cases are solved within a year. For cases involving possible trafficking networks, like Madeleine's, the statistics are even grimmer. About 1% lead to concrete answers. These numbers make me think about how much we still do not understand about Madeleine's disappearance. They show that this is not just a unique case, but part of a much larger global problem. And when we compare these data with the case's patterns, an unsettling question arises: what else might be being ignored while we search for answers? Madeleine McCann's case remains one of the greatest mysteries of our time, but throughout this video, we've seen how it may be connected to something much bigger. It's It's not just about a disappearance. It's about global networks, systemic failures, and a disturbing silence that seems to hide more than it reveals. When I think about everything that has been raised here, the contradictions, the ignored clues, and the repeating patterns, I can't help but feel a sense of urgency. This case reminds us that even in the darkest mysteries, every detail matters. Perhaps the answer is out there, in a forgotten document, in an unreviewed testimony, or even in something we already know but have yet to connect. And now, guardians of the mystery, I want to hear from you. Which theory makes the most sense to you? Was Madeleine a victim of something planned by a global network? Or is there still an explanation that hasn't been considered? If you've made it this far, comment "I seek the truth" to show that you followed to the end and are reflecting on all of this. If you have any mystery or case you'd like to see here on the channel, leave it in the comments. I'm always attentive to your suggestions and can bring one of the topics you indicate to the next videos. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. In the next video, we will delve into an even more challenging case where the unknown mixes with the impossible. Click on the end screen and join me for another enigma that will leave you speechless. Stay vigilant, Guardians. Sometimes the truth is closer than we imagine, but it takes courage to see it.